Political preference. Leaving mission parties aside, why does someone choose right or left? What psychological, socio-psychological, or biological factors play a role in this? Why does one become right-wing? Let's discuss how leftist writer and psychiatrist Kaan Arsanoglu sees the right in his own words. As is to be expected, right-wing individuals tend to be questioning and rebellious in other areas of their personal relationships, but are underdeveloped or non-existent when it comes to social and political issues. They have a strong sense of loyalty to the majority, the conventional, and the past. Compared to leftists, feelings of personal obedience to authority are stronger. They are more traditional and fear innovations and transformations. Their outlook does not question traditional morality and gives little room for individual initiative. They support keeping things as they are. They rely on conventional forces, the elders, or the belief that God will assist them in some way to solve problems, even when they become grave. They are anchored by convictions rather than logic. They don't expect people or societies to change all that much. All they need to do is find their inner strength or seek refuge in God, and goodness will follow. The right works to preserve society, while the left aims to transform people. These are the fundamental inherited tendencies. Because of this, being right-wing is simple. Because of his high level of maturity, man has a natural tendency to be right-wing in the absence of cultural and environmental influences. This is actually what we see. Being right-wing is strongly influenced by the environment. Family comes first when environmental factors are the agenda. It is necessary to be a responsible citizen who abides by established moral principles and laws, as well as to adopt cultural values that will enable one to sacrifice himself for the benefit of society. Almost all of these are nothing more than right-wing propaganda that has been amplified since the early years of childhood. If a person's natural tendency is to resist change and uphold the status quo, then his right-wing tendencies are strengthened by the general conservative education, propaganda, and environment. Even though this is the general situation, we frequently come across circumstances that are contrary to what we have described, due to both genetic and environmental factors. Evaluating the preceding words, we see how complex Turkish psychology is. We can apply political conservatism to the metropolitan CHP elite, while applying social conservatism to the grassroots periphery of Turkey. Let's now see what our MD says about his fellow leftists. Why does one become left-wing? In this case as well, genetic factors predominate. Even if a person is raised in a traditional, ultra-religious family, he can still become leftist if his genetic predispositions are strong enough. Some characteristics of personality, temperament, and thought process, which are visible as early as infancy, exhibit a genetic tendency to the left. First off, it should be noted that terms like right-wing and left-wing are no longer as distinct as they once were. In the last 20 or 30 years, the right hasn't lost much of its influence, but the left has suffered greatly. Therefore, the right sneaked into the left, and the left has never been able to be the ideal left in Turkey. In other words, it has never been able to embrace the labor, the human, and enlightenment. It could never implement democratic participation within itself, and could not break up from conservatism. Trying to break its chains from conservatism, it shifted to liberalism, and beyond it, to the right wing. The fact that a left-wing party today has right-wing and bigoted conservative attitudes is therefore no longer surprising. Still yet, the distinguishing characteristics that make it possible to separate right and left-wing people from one another in terms of ideas, although blurred, can still be figured out. Left for a leftist still means supporting labor, the underprivileged, and the oppressed. In order to practice leftism, one must stand up for human equality and oppose policies and circumstances that do so. No matter their social or economic standing, leftists are those who care more about the oppressed and the poor. They place more emphasis on social justice and equality. Of course, these are not the only genetic factors determining leftism. The rightists may also harbor compassion and pity for the underprivileged. The characteristics of being genetically opposed to and different from the current trend determines leftism. Alevis in Turkey are generally leftists. Similar formations exist in Ireland and many other countries. Due to their sectarian traits, their leftism is a leftism of social acceptance, establishing an identity. They might not understand what it means to be truly rebellious, to question authority, or to be opposed to conventional wisdom. People who turn to leftism due to their environment are groups that harbor negative feelings toward nationalism for a variety of reasons, and who also react negatively to dominant religious tendencies. This is what our psychiatrist, a physician who positions himself on the left, writes. Consider which of the aforementioned traits best describe the Anatolian Turks, who are fighting for change, and which ones best describe our outmoded bureaucracy. Idris Kukukamer holds a different perspective, parallel to what we said in the beginning lines in political psychiatry. The vast majority of Islamist people seen on the right wing are Turkey's progressives. Their social and economic demands, which are flexible to growth, development, and transformation, are what give them this quality. These goals foster the forces of production, undermine society's rigid power structure, and promote pluralism. We now discuss the modernists and conservatives. Modernists. Dilek Imansher says, every modernization is the outcome of the interaction between tradition and innovation. What if we define Turkish modernization as the Muslim urban population's synthesis of its classical tradition and Western modern culture? And Idris Kukukamer, the Orientalist Islamist movement, is one of the two main currents that have aimed to save the Ottoman society by directing it in the last 100 years. The other is the westernmost secular movement. This last trend is the so-called and permanent antithesis of the Islamist current in historical development. The important aspect of the Westernist current is that it appears as a current that prevents the emergence of a real thesis. So, according to Professor Kukukamer, two prevailing theses in Turkey are the Islamist and the Western, and that Westernist current prevents the emergence of a real synthesis. And this is what has happened in the last 100 years. A serious barrier to democratic evolution. Historical social engineering did not succeed in Turkey. Since 1876, traditionally, 75% of the population has always voted for the rightists and only 25% for modernists. The ratio is still the same in 2023. Why do people become Kemalists? Unlike in feudal Europe, Ottomans did not have aristocracy to serve as an example to the populace and inspire imitation and emulation to aspirants. Instead, the désormais bureaucrat ruling class gave its manners, protocol, and lifestyle as a guide to those Reaya who moved from villages to Istanbul. The trend continued with the Republic, especially the rural, war-rich merchants of the early Republican period looked at the bureaucrats for imitation, who, in the 1920s and 30s, were the only literate, quasi-westernized ones. At this point, socioeconomic factors guided social psychology. A millennial morality based on religion and tradition was rapidly eroding as people moved from villages to cities. Values of the agricultural society, which had been passed down for thousands of years, primarily based on religion and tradition, were quickly vanishing during this transformation into lumpenization. Peasants were waking up to the materialism of this world from a millennial slumber living for the next world. Peasant, indifferent towards worldly goods, was swiftly succumbing to materialism's grasp. The millennial awakening of Muslim Turks from living for the next world to living for this materialist world was different from the Christian awakening of enlightenment. Reaya were too late in transformation, and when they woke up, they started attacking the material goods of this world in greed, ready to sacrifice anything for the material goods of this world. And now, the genie was out of the bottle, and nothing could stop them. As Europe started relaxing with full stomachs and European civilization tired, Turks were starting their war for the resources of this world. Early Republicans were the champions of welcoming materialism the West imposed on Turkey. Turkish elite happily and enthusiastically welcomed the positivist, cultural, and economic imposition, and the urge reached manic proportions in the 21st century. Was this what the West wanted? Removing Marx's opium of religion away from the peasants of the world? And the unintended consequences of creating rivals to its own welfare? Should we blame Western capitalism for imposing materialism on the world? Or should Western masses protest such a policy of shooting themselves in the heel? How about the dilemma of the Crusader spirit of eradicating barbaric Islam from the face of the earth, versus making Turks the most fanatic materialists of the world, working with sweat and blood to surpass the West for the resources of this world? As for secular morals, the West developed them and gradually digested them through centuries. Turkish transformation from village to the metropole is so swift, and the traditional morals evaporate so quickly that Turks have to build their own modernity and secular values in a much shorter time. And the estimate is that it would take at least 5 generations for the formation of a new, secular code of ethics. Taking the 1960s as a starting point, we may say we need 2 more generations, meaning perhaps another 40 years, for the new secular urban values to settle down. Back to the new merchants and interests of the uneducated tradesmen who were trying to be successful. They were required to be in harmony with the ideology and lifestyle of the bureaucracy, which was their only patron and benefactor in a non-economy. The representative of this deal was CHP. It became a gentry bureaucrat party. And the state-fed nouveau rich of the early republic gradually evolved to be today's big business. This is the reason why they still vote for the CHP, which represents their class. In short, when viewed from the perspective of history and the lens of Professor Idris Kukukumar, CHP became the party of the bureaucrat capital coalition, neither of the left nor of the underprivileged, both in terms of culture and economy. Let us remember the culture of the déjeuner. The state took the peasant child and alienated him from his origin, making him a statesman. With the Tanzimat and the consequent republic, class alienation became much more radical with westernization. When the sharp-minded merchant coming from the village to the city realizes that the easiest way to get rich in a bankrupt country is to stick to the state for business success, he decides to synchronize his ideology, lifestyle, and commercial interests with that of the ruling bureaucratic elite. Perhaps due to Christian teaching, the greatest evolution of Western civilization was its taming the Western man into a global, hierarchical discipline. Every Western nation knows its level in the global hierarchy and accepts it, whereas Islamic teaching is individualistic. Unlike papal hierarchy, it has no central authority of faith. Add to it the historical Turkic unruly character, and what you get is a nation having trouble adapting to its scala in the global hierarchy of our day. The best example of this is the foreign policy of Erdogan of the rising republic. Yet business is a different case. Capitalist merchant mentality would sacrifice any value for material success, including towing the line of global hierarchy. That is what happened in the West. Homo consumens was made a coward, afraid of losing his job and everything material he gained in life. The same trend is working in Turkish business life. As the business expands, it leaves the countryside and evolves into Istanbul's big capital. Its continuation is global trade, meaning cooperation with global cosmopolitan capital, syncing its interests with the West, entering global hierarchical discipline. Hence, in late Attila İlhan's words, making the merchant bureaucrat duo the economic and cultural compradors of the West. The alliance of soldiers, bureaucrats, and gentry, which started in the early Republican period and was represented by the CHP, continues until the 21st century. The small, provincial pious merchants, rejecting Western modernity and alienation, could only dream of being the local dealers of the great Istanbul capital in Anatolia. Peasant flow to metropoles of about 1920s to 1980s was rather slow, and the city could assimilate the newcomers to its modernist culture. With late President Özal's economic reforms, the flow to the cities accelerated, and the new rush was in such great numbers that elite culture started faltering in assimilating the newcomers. The woman in hijab coming from Anatolia was no longer accepting work as the toilet cleaner of the office. Without removing her headscarf, she wanted to be an ambassador, a general, a doctor, professor, and politician, all she could be in a democratic society. She moved from the slum to the high society districts of Istanbul. Now the conditions have matured and two rival groups have formed. One is the capital of Istanbul, represented by the CHP, and backed by the military-civilian bureaucracy and Western powers, and the other is the Anatolian capital, represented by the AKP, which wants to preserve its historical traditions. Western allies of the elite will distort this class war between the two capitalist groups as a religious, secularist ideology fight. The West vehemently wants its clones educated in Western schools, at the helm, to preserve its interests in Turkey. Local values are a threat to the West. Its unruly, untamable representatives should be prevented from the government by any means. Cadres other than the westernized ones were considered hostile to the West. To repeat Idris Kukukamer, the Orientalist Islamist movement is one of the two main currents that have aimed to save the Ottoman society by directing it in the last 100 years. The other is the westernmost secular movement. This last trend is the so-called and permanent antithesis of the Islamist current in historical development. The important aspect of the Westernist current is that it appears as a current that prevents the emergence of a real thesis. The Tanzimat cadres hoped that the Ottomans would be forgiven by the great powers if they became Westernist. The junta generals of the Republic, who came from the modernist tradition, were in the same fear. For this reason, they tried to prevent parties representing local values from coming to power for a long time. Peasants isolated from the world were unaware of the West's negative thoughts about themselves. Look what Professor Hilmi Yavuz says in The History of Europeans. Toynbee wrote, "We are right to belittle Turkey. Why should we respect those who imitate us? I respect only those who can contribute to my civilization." Yet, the West is the very civilization that prevents the evolution of an Islamic democratic environment. Just like Weber's Protestants, gradual, healthy evolution through a natural process into Christian Democrats. Muslim peoples also want to hold grasp of their own destiny. They want to control their rulers that work for the interest of Western imperialism. As we said, elite military and civilian cadres in Muslim countries, educated in Western schools or Western curricula in Muslim education systems, are the choice of the West to work with. All the rest, educated in Islamic or traditional local mindsets, are seen as a threat, and they must be toppled and replaced by Westernist generals or their obedient civilian cadres to make them seem more democratic than autocratic. To sum up, the West does not let Islamist parties mature into democratic Muslim parties like Christian Democrats in the West. Simply, the West is the enemy of democracy in Islamic countries. Let's not forget that the biggest enemy of imperialism is a democratic society that bravely seeks its rights, protects its state, and does not let itself be exploited. Now we can further deal with interests. It is natural for parties to organize for the interests of their constituents, and at an advanced stage, it is natural for the rural and traditional masses to see their interests in the AKP, while high bureaucracy, Istanbul's big capital and high society, vote for the CHP. How about the rest? The mesmerizing, unnatural, confusing, challenging question is, how come the 20% of the lumpen masses, the historically oppressed, hopeless, uneducated, underprivileged, vote for the CHP, the very representative of the historical déchirme, now the Westernist high bureaucracy, which oppressed them for centuries? The question is the heart of the book in your hand. At this point, I think it is necessary to engage individual and social psychology. As against the great majority of the conservative Turkish population, only about 25% vote for CHP, which claims to represent the left. The reason? Learned helplessness. Remember Nietzsche's conformism? These hopeless do not or cannot afford to oppose their elite oppressors and fight to overthrow them, and they choose to join the class of oppressors. They abandon their families, aunts, uncles, and their values left behind in the countryside and cling to the estranged déchirme in the metropole. The spectacular slogan, "The carrot is so very attractive." Ataturk, Kemalism, progressiveness, modernity, Western lifestyle. The child of the Yoruk Turkmen who was crushed for 1,000 years, now the modern city youth, rejects his past. He doesn't want to remember his heritage. Add to this the fear of excommunication in the lumpen groups of athletes, singers, and soap opera artists. They have a point. Let's also think about adolescent university students who have not yet developed enough self-confidence. Take Ataturk's mausoleum. One must go into 1 minute of silence as learned from the Christian tradition of military attention, accompanied by a trumpet sound. For Muslims, no matter what it stands for, it is a Muslim graveyard and a Muslim praise, Fatiha, with open hands to Allah. Now, the hypocrisy is, in the past, the soldier interrupted anyone praying with open hands, forcing him to military attention. Today, no official enforcement. Fear of guardian generals is gone. Yet a greater fear reigns. If not fear of excommunication, what is the basis of the hypocrisy of military attention, yet whispering prayers inside? We define the lumpenization of the peasant as his transition phase from the village into the metropolitan lifestyle. Psychologically, a peasant aspiring to join the metropolitan bourgeois would be most eager to deny his past. He is now scared to be called the peasant among the city dwellers. He becomes a fanatic anti-peasant, the new déchirme candidate. He is unaware of the fact that the time-proven millennial values of his peasant ancestors are even nobler than the modern values he is aspiring to. As feudals of Europe and other communities had nobility, Ottomans neither had aristocrats nor nobility at the ruling level. For the periphery, there was an equal society with certain privileges of Muslims over non-Muslims, yet no nobility. Halil Inalcik's words, "Let alone your grandfather's, even your father's grave remains unknown." Hence, to talk of nobility is an absurdity for a Turk. Jump to modernity, settlement in the 21st century, and the lumpen seeking noble roots. It is at this point that the inferiority complex of today's lumpen society becomes striking. Inventing pasha grandfather heritages, walls decorated with rusty swords from flea markets, seeking modernization by changing the family name. These are deep psychological issues that require academic analysis. Let's listen to Adler. We often hear from the mouths of such people that their parents also have such an aristocratic character. However, behind this empty desire lies nothing but the tendency to feel like a person who is not like others, comes from an extraordinary family, is endowed with excellent purpose and emotions, is born with a privilege, and is superior to everyone else. As Professor Ilber Orteli said, "It is the inferiority complex of being the grandchildren of peasants who used the same ox cart and plow from the time of the Hittites, with 2 million malaria, 1 million syphilis, 3 million trachomata, millions of tuberculosis, typhus, typhoid, louse-suffering peasants whose average life expectancy was 40 years. As Ataturk wrote to his companion İnönü, "We are the offspring of a collapsed peasant society. How come two clashing worldviews are born of the same root? What causes identity diversion? In other words, why does the majority of the population adhere to Anatolian traditional values, while the minority adheres to Western lifestyle, culture, and cosmopolitan values and marginalize the former? Take the example of a poor boy of the early republic from a remote Muslim village in Anatolia, walking a mile with bare feet to school. How does the son of this poor peasant become the pork-eating champion of high society in Istanbul? Just one generation. Academic research is needed to study this swift, one-generation transformation. Grievances of two towering Muslim nonconformists of the early republic against Western morals and value systems imposed by the early Republican rulers. Not away from the patrie, yet homesick, wandering in tears in my own abode. Mehmed Akif Ersoy. A stranger, a pariah in his fatherland. Nasip Fazil Kisakarek. Did the barefoot Anatolian peasant want his son not to be a pariah in his homeland? Psychological factors indeed contribute to this deep concern. Another approach: vote for ideology, or services democracy, sentiment, or logic in voting. Why do people live in the sewer, voting sentimentally, not for those who would take them to a civilized environment, but for those politicians who keep them in the sewer? Illogical, non-Western behavior. And AKP, champion of services approach, going by Western logic. The modern party of services, of modern infrastructure, whereas CHP, of Ottoman Dejerme DNA, is against swift change, going against the investment in vital infrastructure with the famous Ottoman rejectionism. Is temizuk, we reject. And interestingly, living in their illogical sewer environment, they consider themselves civilized and insist that everyone else live like them. Is this response a resentment-driven reflex of millennia? The argument that we began the Republic as a classless society can be taken as a basis since there are no aristocrats in our nation, and non-Muslim members of the Constantinople bourgeoisie have left. In his letter of 1923 to İnönü, Ataturk explains the starting point as follows. My dear Pasha, I consider you to be the Republic's first Prime Minister. Hold and don't reject. You now realize why I picked you. Another major war is coming. As the front commander and chief Turkish delegate in Lausanne, you are aware of some aspects of our situation, of course. You informed us after your return from Lausanne that the major powers believed that, given our predicament, we would soon give up. I'll give you a quick rundown of the overall situation, which is even more pitiful than you already realize. A sickly, indebted country has been passed down to us. We are a destitute, rural nation. We hardly have any year-round accessible highways. About 4,000 kilometers of railroads exist, but we don't even own a meter of it. Our maritime sector is in terrible shape. Everywhere, usurers abuse our people. Even though we are ostensibly an agricultural nation, we import the majority of our bread flour. Our livestock is dying from rinderpest. Only 337 doctors, 434 health officers, and 136 midwives are employed in the country. Pharmacies are rare in urban areas. Our people are dying from pandemics. We have 3 million trachoma patients. Laos is a serious problem. Our population is sick to the core. Infant deaths exceed 60%. Of the population, 80% live in rural areas. It is mostly nomadic. No phone, no engine, no machine. We import industrial products from abroad. We even import tiles. Only a small portion of Istanbul and Izmir's districts have access to electricity. 830 villages have been burned by the enemy. There have been 114,408 building fires. Nearly all of the country needs to be rebuilt. More than 400,000 immigrants will come from Greece. Both our economic situation and educational system are in terrible condition. We have few economists here. Only 1/4 of the children who are of school age can be enrolled. Problem of public education could never have been dealt with. We must develop the Republic's human capital and fortify the front of our honor. I wanted to share with you the importance and honor of this monumental undertaking. God help us. According to historian Ilber Orteli, the table is as follows. In 1920, around 12 million people lived in the country, 11 million residing in villages. No tractors. Hittite practice of primitive plow and oxen were the agricultural way. There were about 2 million people with malaria, 1 million with syphilis, and 3 million with trachoma in Anatolia. Tuberculosis, typhus, and typhoid epidemics were rampant. 1 out of every 2 babies born died before reaching the age of 1. The average life expectancy was about 40 years. 337 doctors, 160 pharmacists, and 106 midwives were in the nation. There was no dentist with a license. The literacy rate was 5% for men and 5% for women. Literate men were mostly either military officers or non-Muslims. In any case, 3 out of every 4 kids of school age did not attend school. Only 23 high schools existed. 1/3 of the teachers lacked even basic preparation for teaching. There was only 1 university that was superior to the madrasah, Darul Funun. Do you have any idea how many books have been published in the 150 years since Ibrahim Mutafarrika? There were only 417. With his study, Turkey de Yeni Hayat, New Life in Turkey, Zafer Toprak perfectly captures the dreadful times we have lived in. Citing Dr. Hakai Sanasi Pasha, nation's child mortality rate was extremely high, around 80%. The circumstances for the remaining 20% were also dire. Yes, 80% to 90% of infant deaths occurred before reaching age 1. How did the remaining 10% fare? To this, Sabaya Zechariah added, orphans were the first to appear. There were about 200,000 of them. The state patronized a small portion of it. 190,000 were left on the streets. 9 out of 10 of the kids could not get enough to eat. Illegitimate children were the 3rd group to experience victimization. A significant portion of them died on the streets, while others died inside the Darul Leseze orphanage. Children being forced to beg on the streets by some trade companies was another child tragedy. A sizable portion of the underprivileged children spent the day wandering around and sleeping in mosque courtyards, under bridges, and at the base of fountains. Some of the kids had physical and intellectual disabilities. Among them were the deaf, dumb, blind, and lame. Of the remaining 5% of uneducated children, Sabaya Zechariah removed lazy, stupid, sluggish, or who were unable to finish their physical development by working in physically demanding jobs. Only 2% were left for the future of the nation. How a modern nation, a democracy, could be established using this ratio. The Republic's main issue was this. Why these gloomy facts? I assert they are the roots of the inferiority complex of our lumpen high society. They try to forget this gloomy heritage, hating where they came from. They make an effort to put the past behind them, trying to forget the gendarme beatings, the trachoma-ridden peasant grandmothers and grandfathers, and pretending to be of aristocratic heritage. In extreme denial, they think they are Americans. They desire to assimilate into a Christian Western community as soon as possible. It is because of the historical alienating educational philosophy, which we still haven't managed to correct. In the Republican era, the ability of Enderun's education to separate the peasant from his original way of life still continued unabated. Today, 90% of young, alienated graduates want to leave the country. Furthermore, it will not be easy to resolve the atmosphere of hatred in our politics without delving into the psychological depths of these aspiring metropolitan lumpens with diplomas pouring into the streets with contemporary and progressive claims unaware of the manipulations of foreign interests. Individual psychological and socio-psychological studies of the lumpen society in Istanbul can shed important light on the serious social disease of alienation from our heritage, which plagues our day. We may surmise that as the process of transformation from peasant to lumpenism to bourgeois, and from social adolescence to maturation develops in its natural course, hostility to the village and the hatred of the past may gradually decrease. Another interesting socio-psychological observation: highly educated, prosperous AKP yuppies, even studied at Ivy League and other best universities of the world, sometimes see those primary school graduate CHP members as a superior class, or white tribe, like in the Indian caste system. Deep analysis of this inferior black tribe psychology, accepting the social stigma posed on them, needs attention. Forget those uneducated CHP flock. Those with diplomas, accepted intellectuals of our country, are simply parroting ideas produced in the West without adding anything to them, just memorizing the oral cultural genes of Anatolian peasants. Inspired by Professor Errol Golka, let's briefly discuss the concepts of white versus black. An extreme case: the family offers 5 daily prayers. Father dressed in traditional, rural, baggy shalwar, skullcap, and clogs. The child is well educated, holds a high rank in the public or private sector, has severed ties to his religion, indulges in alcohol and pork consumption, and, if feminine, dons a bikini. She is scared of being seen with her mother wearing a hijab in modern settings. Given her position and feeling cut off from the lifestyle of her family, she also views them with disgust and hatred. Can we now classify this family, Black Turks, and their offspring, White Turks, as belonging to the same social group? How many societies have a significant, radical shift in class within a single generation within the same family? Our academics have so much work to do on multidisciplinary research on cultural rupture, alienation, and beyond that, self-hatred beginning in the family. Conservatives. As the saying goes, every political power creates its own bourgeoisie. The faithful Anatolian capital undoubtedly prospered during the AKP era, and quickly, happily, started enjoying capitalist consumption. Pious businessmen started to purchase homes in the wealthy areas of the metropoles, as well as shop and eat in upscale establishments. Not to lose focus, our topic is still not Anatolia's underprivileged. We're talking about a new capitalist class emerging from Anatolia to challenge the old capitalists and the old westernized bureaucracy. A new class rising to modernity, yet refusing to be alienated, trying to cling to its traditional culture. If an aristocracy does arise in the 21st century, it will, in my opinion, do so from conservative religious capital rather than the volatile liberal cosmopolitan capital. The aristocratic class holds traditional values. It rejects eradicating roots, frequent changes, and sharp class changes. Therefore, the likelihood that the Turkish aristocracy of the future will be made up of pious capital is higher than that of liberalist, globalist capitalists. As for culture, one of the main reasons why Westernists have disdain for the new religious bourgeoisie is its modern cultural defects, and the pious new bourgeois is meek to meet the accusation. In actuality, By making this accusation, Westerner white Turks are shooting themselves in the heel because they are sleeping in the conformity of parroting what is produced in the West. Since 19th century Tanzimat, they are just the compradors, consumers, and distributors of culture and concepts developed in the West. Here are Toynbee's words once more. We are right to denigrate Turkey. Why should we respect those who copy us? I only respect people who add to my civilization. In their sleep, in conformity, and self-praise, they have no rooted incentive to create a challenging culture against the West. Except for a few, they do not have enough authentic Turkish production to be presented to the world. Not in literature, except for a few, in music, architecture, technology, or the visual arts. Because their closed peasant ideology Kemalism of the 1940s neither has universal ethical nor aesthetic concerns. It seems illogical to expect genuine cultural innovation from people who have been comfortably sleeping on Western culture for nearly 2 centuries. Expecting local, authentic cultural Turkish values to rise from the alienated, unrooted Western clones was a grave mistake. With President Erdogan, the new Anatolian bourgeois started to feel the pain, and this new bourgeois was the candidate to give birth to genuine Turkish modernity. For the awakening, Erdogan does not hesitate to cooperate with the old Istanbul capital and get their support in opening new joint museums and culture centers too. Ending this section, a comic narrative of the 1968 youth. A walking library hailing from the village tradition of his grandfathers and oral culture of memorizing the Quran, now a Marxist, tests the memorization of another peasant-origin Marxist friend. He commands his mate to recite a certain sentence from a certain page of Das Kapital. Parroting was all they needed. No philosophizing. Or take a Kemalist eager to gain respectability in the traditional verbal memorization culture, reciting Ataturk aphorisms in his modern group, and the sterility and lack of philosophical and intellectual creativity for modern Turkish society, and further, for the rest of the world. Taking a break in the footsteps of his 19th century young Turk brothers, mission civilisatrice tradition, shepherding the flock, let's hear a student from American Robert College in Istanbul again. The year is 1951. Robert College taught us about American ideals. Now, I try to pass these on to our peasants who are poor, ignorant, and opposed to change. In the face of these hurdles, our best weapon is the Americans, good books, and good ways. About 20 years later, this time the youth of 1968, shepherds are coming from the left. Take the neighboring school's Ankara University Faculty of Political Sciences, Mulkiye, and Faculty of Law, my school. The time when the parka combat boot mustache was in fashion. The so-called leftist Cumhuriyet newspaper was placed in the parka's pocket with care. Young peasant students claimed to change the order. They said they were socialists. However, their subconscious, which they were unaware of, operated differently. They were the same peasants who came to college to be alienated from their peasant families and then joined the ruling elite cadres. To lead the backward peasant society was the motivation behind leaving the village and joining the décharmé class. Proof? Many of those 1968ers are the high society of Istanbul, championing Americanism and capitalism in their gray 70s.